Hello again and welcome. This is Susan, and today I'm going to be talking about coherence and perception. We've been talking a lot about writing and how the communication model can affect your writing. Things like audience, purpose, word choice. We talked about connotation and denotation. And today we're going to be looking more at the sentence and paragraph level to see what kinds of things you can do to make sure that your intended meaning matches the perception that is received by your reader. So sometimes there can be a gap in understanding between how we read our essays and how others read our essays. So we want to make sure that the reader receives the same message that we're sending. We're going to be talking about constructing paragraphs in ways that are clear and easy to follow, which is coherent, and one of the tools that you can use to achieve that. So the first thing I'm going to do is read a short paragraph to you, and as I'm reading I want you to think about what the main idea of this paragraph is. The procedure is actually quite simple. First you arrange things into different groups. Of course, one pile may be sufficient depending on how much there is to do. If you have to go somewhere else due to lack of facilities, that is the next step. Otherwise, you're pretty well set. Next, you operate the machines according to the instructions. After the procedure is completed, one arranges the materials into different groups again. Then they can be put into their appropriate places. Eventually, they will be used once more, and the whole cycle will have to be repeated. However, that is part of life. So let's return to my original question. What is this paragraph about? What's the main idea? And if you look here in the first sentence for a subject, we do see this word procedure. And there's a lot of words in the paragraph that allude to what this procedure might be. Instructions, it's a how-to paragraph. Talk about some facilities, we talk about some piles and completing our procedure, but I'm not quite sure we could say exactly what the paragraph is about. I have had some interesting guesses in the past. I did have a student guess once that it's about the meaning of life. This paragraph tells you how to get through life. That's a good guess, but it's not quite what I think the reader intended. So we have to ask ourselves, why is it that we don't know what this paragraph is about? And some of the questions that you want to ask are, okay, what types of things do we do in order to make sure that we are understood? And one thing that perhaps you might say is, well, we make sure all of our words are spelled correctly, and that's a good thing to do. So if we could just look at this paragraph and see, are all of our words spelled correctly? And I would say that they did a pretty good job. Another thing you might say is, well, is punctuation used properly? Is the grammar correct? And I would say yes. We've got some advanced punctuation, we've also got some simple structures in here, and they all look pretty correct. And so another thing that we do, you can start sort of listing off things, but another thing that we do, especially in a how-to paragraph, is we use transitional phrases. And I would say they did a pretty good job of that as well. We've got first, next, eventually, and so lots of transitions, lots of time indicators, but still we don't know what the paragraph is about. So if I gave you an additional piece of information and I said this paragraph is about doing laundry, and we replaced procedure with doing laundry, it would instead read doing laundry is actually quite simple, and then the rest of the paragraph would fall into place. And so what we're going to be talking about is pieces of information. Doing laundry, the procedure in this paragraph, is called the known, and we're going to be talking today about three different types of information: known information, new information, and old information. And when you're constructing a paragraph, everything in that paragraph should fall into one of these three categories. So of these categories, known, new, and old, as you can see, looking back at our communication model again, you've got a lot of information in your reality as a writer that the receiver does not have. And what can often happen in writing is you'll write a paper and you'll think, man, this is an awesome paper. My teacher's really going to love this. And you turn it in and you wait and you get the paper back and you have all of these marks on it, right, that say awk for awkward, and maybe lots of red pen and question marks, very large, obscure question marks on your paper. And you think, gosh, that makes total sense to me. And sometimes you might even read your instructor's comments and wonder, how did they not understand that? It says it right there. So what has happened is there's been a breakdown in communication, and it's likely a result of your construction of known, new, and old information. So what I'm going to be talking about is what these different types of information are and how to construct them in meaningful ways in order to be understood and to give a reader the construction that they expect, and so that way they don't have to work too hard to understand whatever it is that you're trying to say. So in this short paragraph here, we're going to be just identifying the known, new, and old information and how it relates to the subject of the paragraph. So the known information is going to be the type of information that the reader and the writer share. This is going to be some kind of common ground that's established at the beginning of the paragraph. And you'll assume throughout the rest of the paragraph that you share that piece of information. For this reason, there's generally only one known in a paragraph. In a compare and contrast, there might be two knowns, the two things that you're comparing and contrasting that make up the known, but there's only going to be one subject, one main idea, one known for that paragraph. So if we look here for the known, it starts, unlike many lower animals that use their noses to detect mates, predators, and prey, humans do not depend on their sense of smell for survival. So you can see there's a pretty long introductory clause. Don't let that mislead you. The subject here, the thing that does not depend on its sense of smell for survival, is humans. And therefore humans is the known of the paragraph. That's the main idea. That's what the whole rest of the paragraph will be about. The next kind of information that we can expect is new information, especially at the beginning of a paragraph. So now that you've established something in common, humans, we both know what humans are, we're going to give you some new information about humans, and that's going to be this piece of information here, the fact that they do not depend on their sense of smell for survival. Even if you already knew that, it's still new information in this paragraph as far as the sender and receiver go. So because this information about their sense of smell has not been presented previously in this paragraph, that makes it new. Okay, and you could contextualize the paragraph within an essay, and that does change what's new and old, but for now we're just looking at the paragraph level. So let's look at the third sentence. Nevertheless, the sense of smell in humans is incredibly sensitive. So we've got some different kinds of information here. The sense of smell is the first piece of information. Sense of smell was mentioned right here. So since this information is not new, and it's not the known, because there's only one known, and that is humans, the subject, that makes it old information. It's repeated. We already heard about the sense of smell. The next piece of information is in humans. That is also old information. It is the known of the paragraph, but it is only called the known the very first time it's mentioned. After that, it's always referred to as old information, and it's a piece of building. So you can see here just a review of what I've been saying about these pieces of information. The humans, the subject, the topic, that's your known. The new information, the repeated or old information, and then again new information. And what I want to look at here is the pattern that you're going to start to see. It's not that information will always alternate known, new, old, new, old, new, old, new, old. But that's a pretty good pattern for a paragraph. If you aren't quite sure how to write and you're still learning, you can always default to, okay, here's my known, here's new information, bring in repeated information, bring in new information, repeat, new, old, new, and that's a pretty healthy pattern. Sometimes with introductory clauses and the way that we change our sentences around, you might have a pattern of known. Usually it starts known, new, old, and then it can alternate in any which way, but it might be old, old, new, 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 old. But you want to think carefully when you're introducing new information, just to give you something to compare it to. We'll look at this video on building a scaffold. And I like to think of building a scaffolding as kind of a way to build an essay. You know, you build the initial layer and it gives the reader something to stand on as you start to build up the rest of the building. So you need to have a foundation first. And then once you have that known information and your foot is firmly there, you can climb up, stand on the known, and then add a new piece of information. And before you can go up each layer, you have to kind of come back down and then up again and down and then up again until you get the entire building put around you. You're building information and you're building this common zone where both you and the reader can share your field of experience. And without that, you might not have the type of understanding and the type of perception that you want the reader to have. So you have to be really careful when you're building your information to make sure that you're building on something that is already a stable foundation for the reader. If you don't create that foundation, even if it exists in your mind, it doesn't mean that they're going to understand it.